Actually, as I was standing there listening, I thought, the best way to start off would be to do an incredible musical rendition like Ed did. But as I stand here, it occurs to me, I don't play any instruments, so we'll forego that. Okay. Albert Einstein once said, only those who attempt the absurd will achieve the impossible. My attempt at the absurd began several months after torrential rainfall sent a massive wall of water, mud, and debris smashing into Uduwatete, leaving 11 dead and a village decimated. 6 years earlier, I had begun to give about a month of my time each year to development projects in Ethiopia. One day in August 2004, in a meeting with the president of the Southern Peoples Region, I was informed of the tragedy at Udu. And then after buttering me up with compliments, the president went on to request that I take over a failed reforestation project. The project design was supposed to restore the forest along the steep escarpment hillsides above the Udu villages. He added a bit of pressure and said, if this next phase isn't successful, then for their own safety, the villagers will be forcefully removed. In other words, they become eco-refugees. No pressure. But several hours later, I found myself face to face with the village elders and looking out on an ecological nightmare. The villagers began their story by telling me about the good old days when the forest was thick, wildlife and water were abundant, farming was terrific. But those days were long gone. Within the course of just one lifetime, 98% of the forest had been cut down. The streams and the springs had dried up. Sustainable farming was nearly impossible, and then of course came the massive wall of devastation. So as we continue to talk, elders and Steve, Fitch, I asked them, do you really want your forest back? And they insisted, yes, they did. But a troubling question was forming in my own mind. How in the world could I possibly succeed where so many well-funded experts had already failed? My personal reality is I was not academically prepared to take on the project. My bachelor's degree was in business, my master's and doctoral studies were in theology. Nevertheless, I felt a deep sense of conviction that somebody had to do something, and I also had a lifelong skill from an unusual childhood that allowed me to sit and listen respectfully to third world villagers' concerns. And in this case, their economic concerns are what the experts had ignored. The inconvenient truth is extremely poor people often do desperate, even destructive things as a means to survive. If you've ever driven through rural Africa, you will see women carrying massive bundles of wood on their back. While this may seem innocent enough, what we comfortable Westerners don't understand is that one of the primary causes of global deforestation, and hear this, involves literally millions of villagers, each cutting down 2, 3, 4 live trees every single week to make charcoal. Sadly, they only end up making a couple of dollars per tree, but it's how they survive. So after further consideration and discussion, the idea that came to mind was simple. Not easy, but simple. Eden Reforestation Projects was formed as a nonprofit organization with the specific goal of providing employment to local villagers to grow, guard, and plant native species trees, leading to a restored forest. And with a cash-paying job back, or for the first time in their lives, they would be able to escape the destructive charcoal business. Eden Reforestation Projects now calls our cure employ to plant. Yeah, we worked really hard on that one. Employ to plant. And it's really both simple and empowering. And within just a matter of a couple of years, proof of concept began to appear. And before the project was actually complete, 9 years later, the village planters put over 9 million trees into the ground. The canopy was restored, and we achieved a high degree of success. So in case you missed it, this is the Udu Three Hills Region project before, and this is really the same place later. It's a lot better. So Ethiopia was our first test. Madagascar was next on the absurdity list. In 2006, a friend of mine, Jamie Schottenberg, began to tell me about Mahabana, a small fishing village located on the west coast of Madagascar. Mahabana's story is very similar to Udu in the sense that over the decades, out of economic desperation, the villagers had cut down the mangrove trees in their estuary. If you're not familiar with mangroves, mangroves are a unique species group of trees that only grow in salt and brackish water. And they're rather amazing. They have incredibly dense root systems that of course grow below the ground, but also above the ground. And the above the ground roots serve as a buffer against storms. But now with the mangrove swamps or estuaries depleted of mangroves, the annual storm cycle was coming in and wiping out the village with regularity. So Jamie proposed that we consider launching a small experimental mangrove restoration effort, planting propagules, mangrove propagules, which are baby mangrove trees. And I remember asking Jamie, do you know anything about mangroves? And he said, not really, not much, and I admitted similar level of ignorance. But we moved ahead with the project because we were confident that the villagers understood mangroves. And our confidence in their knowledge was soon well-founded because within the course of just the next 6 months, that handful of villagers put over 200,000 mangroves into the ground with a 90% plus survival rate. That small initial experimental project has turned into something larger. Today, there are over 550 planters in Madagascar, planting in an average month over 2,700,000 more mangroves every single month. And you heard the number right, 2,700,000 every single month. To date, in the last 10 years, they've already put 134 million mangroves into the ground, and there are massive areas of restored and maturing mangrove trees in multiple estuaries. And in case you missed it, this is where we started. That's bad. This is the same place just 6 years later, so much better. What I'd like you to understand, though, at this point is planting mangroves and planting trees has actually not proven to be the most difficult part of the story. A show of hand, please. How many of you are aware that trees have actually been growing by themselves for some time now? Anybody out there? Okay, smart audience, yes. The toughest part by far has been when we've come face to face with corruption and oppression that are so commonly linked to extreme poverty. And the form of oppression that we faced in Mahabana was indentured servanthood. When we launched the project, we did not know that the majority of the villagers were caught up in indentured servanthood or debt bondage, designed by a group of thugs that we now call the fish lords. The exciting news is when Employ to Plant went to work with these villagers, they quickly paid off their debt. They even bought their own boats and fishing nets and escaped debt bondage. The tough part is the same Employ to Plant methodology was destroying the lucrative business of the fish lords, and they chose to fight back. They started by poisoning 2 of our leaders at a communal meal. 1 died, and another was hospitalized for many months. Their efforts continued, and it reached, I guess you'd say, a different kind of new low in September 2012. At that time, I was part of a leadership team that came to monitor the work at Mahabana. And when we landed on the shore, the local authorities quickly confronted us, and they placed us under hut arrest. And we were charged with trying to steal, ironically charged with trying to steal the villagers' property. Thankfully, the villagers, our wonderful team, quickly rallied to our defense and demanded a trial, and within just a few hours of testimony, we were exonerated, and rightfully, it was the fish lords who were found guilty of trying to steal the villagers' property. Please know that the fight against oppression, and I've just barely touched on this story, has been worth it. Because in this case, in Mahabana, we've already seen several hundred villagers, through the dignity of employment, pay off their debt and win their freedom. So what we've discovered is there's a multiplication of benefits that begin to flow out of this effort of providing the poorest of the poor with a job to restore their forest. Both ecological and humanitarian benefits. On the ecological side, I'm sure you're aware that we're living in an era of catastrophic mass extinction of species because, in large part, of radical deforestation across the planet. One such species group, so the lemurs of Madagascar, who are now considered the most endangered mammal species group on the planet. But here's what we've seen. When forests are restored, nature is incredibly resilient. And you see this proliferation of life that starts with, of course, the trees and then the leaf litter and then insects at the base of the food chain. And it's quickly followed by the return of birds, small mammals, and reptiles. And then eventually even the big guys can start to show back up. Got an email again this morning. The villagers in Nepal are both pleased and concerned by the return of the elephants to our project sites there. On the humanitarian side, the problem we began to see disappear was illiteracy. There are now well over 1,000 children in the region of Mahabana that are receiving an education for the first time in their lives. Why? Because their parents can afford their tuition from their own wages, not from a child sponsorship program. So again, when you combine caring for the poor and caring for the planet, wonderful things can happen. But I know that some of you are undoubtedly are skeptical, and there's room for skepticism. One of the most commonly asked questions that we're asked is, how do you know that the trees in the forest that you planted won't be cut back down again? Well, we put into practice a series of principles that have sustained our forest for the last 10 years, 12 years. And it starts off with providing villagers with a job so they can escape desperation. Then we make sure that 10% of the trees are fruit, fodder, and construction wood trees for the long-term sustainable needs of the villagers. We also do everything possible to provide the villagers with alternative fuel sources to charcoal, such as fuel-efficient dry wood stoves and parabolic ovens. Both of these eliminate the need to cut down live trees. We also hire villagers to serve as guards against grazing animals that might come in and eat the seedlings and the saplings. Finally, and most significantly, we've seen time and again that when villagers restore their area forest, they fall in love with their forest, and no one's cutting down their forest again. Eden now has around 3,000 villagers working with us in multiple nations. And on average, our 3,000 workers are putting 27 trees per person per day into the ground. And this wonderful benefit and outcome on both sides of the equation are occurring. And I know this sounds absurd to some, but I can't help but wonder what would happen if 10 million villagers were hired to plant 27 trees per person per day. The results would be phenomenal globally. First, massive amounts of carbon would be sequestered across the globe, cooling the planet. Then habitat would be restored for endangered species across the planet. And aquifers and streams and springs would be recharged because forests are the sponges of the earth. All of these ecological benefits would occur simultaneous as around 100 million impoverished villagers and their dependent family members would be lifted out of extreme poverty and oppression. So from my perspective, the only true absurdity is to continue to believe that the experts, the politicians, and I've got a doozy of a president, and even the big planner groups, like the UN and the World Bank, that we think that they're suddenly going to come up with the answers and solutions. Perhaps it's long past time that you and I, pardon me if I say it this way, the common person with common sense and no political or economic agenda, accepted that we're responsible. Perhaps it's time that we dedicate ourselves to that troubling issue that keeps us awake at night. So what issue does keep you awake at night? Perhaps your idea and your dedication will prove to be the next convenient answer. Thank you so much.